Hi guys, this is Nia and today I have a new painting for you. I'll be painting a vase of hydrangeas. This one is probably better suited for intermediate painters since it has many layers, but I still tried to break it down into smaller steps, so hopefully it's still easy to understand if you want to try it out, and you can also get some insight of how I paint my more detailed paintings. So let's begin by drawing it out first. Like usual, hydrangea flowers are basically a huge clump of flowers which consist of tiny little flowers. They're usually 4-petaled flowers which sort of has a diamond shape for the petals. Because these flowers have large clumps, the stems are usually fairly thick to support it, and they also have large leaves with jagged edges, but I'm only going to paint regular leaves for this painting. Here's a larger version of the petals. They're usually a little bit more rounded than this, but since it's not an ordinary petal shape, I find it a bit easier to divide the space using the diamond shapes. Since I'm going to be painting the flowers in a vase, you can also sketch out the shapes of different vases to see which one you like. I personally like round ones because I think that it complements the hydrangeas more, but it's really up to you. The steps that I'm going to show you today can be applied to different shapes as well, so feel free to play around with this. Before painting, I like to usually compose the arrangement first to see if it suits the vase and also if the arrangement will be nice to look at. When I'm sketching this out, I always try to just draw out the rough silhouette of the flowers, which I'm going to form as circles. The most important thing, in my opinion, is to have main arrangement in the middle, and I like those flowers to be pretty compact with each other while still leaving a bit of space for leaves. Once you have the main arrangement, that's when you can start to add the filler leaves or filler flowers if you would like to, but I'm just going to stick with the hydrangeas for this one. Since I like the round vase, I'm going to make an arrangement for it by creating the circles, and while doing this, it's important to also know which flowers you want to be at the front and which ones are going to be at the back to start forming some depth and perspective into the sketch. I also like to add another circle or oval to show where the flowers are facing. I think that even from the sketch, you can already start to see the form of those hydrangeas. So just take your time and maybe try a few to see which ones you like, since it doesn't take long to sketch out. Next, I'll quickly go over my color palette. I'll just swatch them out, but I'll show you how I'm going to mix them during the painting. So I'm going to list them from the top. The first blue is Manganese Blue by Winsor Newton, followed with Ultramarine Violet by Amgram, then Mineral Violet by Holbein, and on the right hand side is Cobalt Violet Light, Jaune Brilliant 2, and also Queen Opera, all by Holbein. Then for the leaves, I'm going to be using Sap Green and Viridian by Holbein, then Hansa Yellow by Daniel Smith, finished with Burnt Sienna by Holbein. I'm also going to use Chinese White by Holbein to create pastel colors, and also White Gouache by Winsor Newton for the final touch-ups. I'm going to show you how I roughly draw out the petals, so what I'm showing you here will be a bit too detailed, but just keep this one in mind because I'll use this only towards the end of the painting. But what I'm going to do most of the stages is painting using small thick strokes in different directions to only suggest the clumps of small flowers. I'm going to show you again up close so you can take a good look before we start painting. Before I paint, I like to draw out the composition that I sketched out before. The reason why I still sketched it separately is because I don't want to erase too much on my watercolor paper, so I always like to plan separately. I also made sure that the sketch is nice and light so I can cover it up with my watercolors. I'm going to start painting now, and the color I first start with is the Ultramarine Violet. I am only going to use a thin consistency of this since we're just mapping out the colors, and I'm using the short thick strokes that I mentioned before, painting it in different directions to get a flower texture. For the next one, I'm adding some manganese blue to the previous mix, and I'm not too worried about the colors at this time because we're going to pile on a bunch of other colors as we progress anyway. where it's a bit more purple and blue at the end because I prefer it that way. But at this stage, this is where you can somewhat explore with your colors to see what you like. So I'm just going to show you a bunch of color mixes that you can work with. For the next one, I added more manganese blue to make the blue even brighter. So as you can see, by just changing up the ratio, your mixes can also slightly change the tone of color. Then after that, I'm going to add some cobalt violet light. But as you can see, as I apply this, because it's only adding a slight purple tone, the blue is a little bit too similar to the ultramarine violet. So I decided to add more Quin Opera to make it more purple. Then for the next one, I'm going to make a soft pink color by adding more Quin Opera in the mix with some white and a touch of Jaune Brilliant, and this is going to be applied to the top left flower as well. And for the couple last ones, I'm going to use Cobalt Violet Light and also Manganese Blue straight from the palette. Next, I want to map out a little bit of the shadows. So for the pink colored flowers, I'm just going to use Cobalt Violet Light by itself to map out some of the darker areas. And as for the purple and blue flowers, I'm going to add Ultramarine Violet with the Cobalt Violet Light, but I'm going to use a fairly thin consistency for this. I'm only using soft colors at this point because hydrangeas are very light in color, so I only want to add on light colors at the beginning, or else the painting might look too heavy and bulky. And as I apply the paint, I try to remember where each of the flowers are facing, and I try to enhance that from the light shadows that I'm painting in right now. I basically try to make the area where I drew the smaller circles lighter than the rest, but I also want to add tiny little specks of the darker tones to slightly break the silhouette of the sphere, because sometimes those clumps of flowers may also have little gaps between the flowers. You can also add some of the darker tones where the pinks are, but don't overwhelm it at this point. So as you can see, there's a bunch of different colors here. If this is what you like, then I would advise you to add more pinks in the mixes for the rest of the shadows instead of the purples and blues that I'm using. Basically, I just want the base color to peek through very subtly, but the overall color that I want to be mostly is purples and blues at the end. So just be mindful of this if you're painting along and you want to adjust the colors. Next, I want to start painting some of the leaves. I'm going to start with a light green mix, and for this I'm going to use a mixture of sap green, Hansa yellow, and a little bit of burnt sienna. But on the side, I also want to have a little bit of Viridian and also Hansa yellow to alternate the colors slightly so it doesn't look too flat. You can apply the leaves anywhere you want now that you have the basic composition of the flowers. So I'm just going to place mine around the flowers, also in the middle where there's a gap in between the arrangement. Here I added a touch of Viridian into the mix to create a darker green, and I'm going to place it as a little bit of shadows for the leaves where the leaves are touching the flowers. And I'm just going to continue painting the leaves until I'm fairly happy with the composition. You can always alternate the ratios of the colors whenever you want. Sometimes I like to also add a little bit of burnt sienna if the green is a bit too vibrant, but at this point I still want the greens to be fairly light because I'm going to build on the shadows of the leaves after this step. For a little added element, I also decided to add a small cluster of young flowers using the light green mix at the back just for a little variation. So now I can start adding the darker leaves, which I'm going to place behind the light colored ones. And for that, I used a mixture of Viridian and Ultramarine Violet, and I'm mixing this next to the light so I can also take a little bit of it to lighten the mix slightly. Using this green, I'm going to place more leaves behind the lighter ones, especially where the gap of the flowers are. If you're into modern loose style paintings, I think you can stop here with the flowers since you can already start to see a clear form of the arrangement. So if you like soft colors, you can move on and skip to the vase portion of this painting. But if you would like to build on the value for more detailed paintings, we can continue to the next step, which I'm going to create an even darker green here by using ultramarine violet, viridian, and also a touch of burnt sienna, which I use the colors to paint the rest of the gaps. I also forgot to paint the leaves for the flower on the side here, so I'm just going to go ahead and do that. This is where I start layering the darker values for the flowers, and for this I used a mix of all the dark colors in the palette. So it's ultramarine violet, mineral violet, and I'm also going to place some viridian on the side. I'm using a medium to thin consistency for this to start since it's already quite dark in value, and I'm going to place this around the flowers using small brush strokes. As we're building up on the value, you'll start to realize that the base color is now very light in comparison, so the colors look a bit dull. So I like to alternate by painting the shadows as well as balancing the intensity of the base colors, so hopefully you still remember the colors roughly. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, and you can also swatch it on scrap paper to make sure you have a similar tone. Remember to always use the same brush strokes and painting sparingly for the texture to still come through. And after building up on those individual colors, you'll start to see that you're able to build on the contrast of values again. So just alternate, and for the dark tone that I used before, I can start to use a thicker consistency to create an even darker value. I'm just going to speed this up slightly so you can see how the painting slowly evolved to having more of a distinct form by slowly building up on the contrast. I apologize for having to speed up a lot of the parts for this tutorial. It was a matter of either skipping some of the repetitive steps or speeding it up, and I thought that by speeding it up, you'll also be able to see a better progression of the painting. Hopefully this is still understandable and easy to follow along. This is where I start getting into the very deep colors by using a very thick consistency of the dark mixture, which is made out of ultramarine violet, viridian, and mineral violet. And I'm going to place this color at the darkest parts of the flowers as well as some parts of the gaps for the leaves, because those parts are supposed to be the deepest or the furthest area. So basically, when you're going through each step, make sure that the rest of the painting is well balanced. That's why I always do touch-ups on different areas at the same time. So as you probably noticed, now the leaves are the parts which needs a bit of work. So here I've increased the value for certain areas, and I also added details for the veins for some of the leaves, so it's equally worked on. We're on to my favorite part of the painting now. So here I like to bring across the different hues of the flowers. So as an example, I like to add some pinks on the blue and purple flowers, and I also like to add some of the blues and purples to the pink flowers, and I think that this brings the color together nicely in a more harmonious way. But do this sparingly so you're still able to see some of the base colors peeking through, and this way it'll look like you have a variety of different colors in one cluster without making everything look exactly the same. Be mindful though that whenever you layer on the different colors, make sure that the other colors surrounding that area are completely dry, or else you might end up muddying the colors instead. I also like to introduce another color to the flowers, and that's the yellow-green that we used for the young flowers, since these flowers usually have a bit of yellow-green in them, and I personally feel like this added yellow-green adds a subtle pop of color as well as a glowy effect, and the mix of hues just brings more life into the painting. Now we're going to add the stems for the flowers, and for this I'm going to use the light green mix like before. I'm going to use a medium consistency of this so I can use the colors confidently. To paint the stems, I like to make sure that the direction is roughly close to where the flowers are facing, and make sure that they're facing different angles to make the placement look more realistic. I like to also add tiny gaps in between the lines for the stems so it doesn't look completely straight, and I'm just going to leave them to dry for the time being and move on to the next step. Next, I'm going to paint the vase, and for this I want to use the same dark green mixture as before, which is a mixture of mineral violet, viridian, and ultramarine violet. I also switched to my small brush so I can create rather thin lines for this. To paint the vase, I first paint the outline with a thick consistency as well as painting the waterline. Then using a mid-tone green, I'm going to paint the top parts of the vase close to the flowers to give it some depth. Then I smudged everything together so that area looks a bit darker than the rest. Then I'm also going to darken the waterline again at the front. Then I'm going to enhance the vase, so I used the same green mixture but in a lighter consistency to do a really light wash in certain areas to give it a little bit of reflection at the bottom as well as the sides, with a couple of lines to enhance the roundness of the vase. I want to create a light background, so for this I'm going to create a grayish color by just mixing all of the colors that I have on my palette, and as you can see here it's creating a muddy color but it's a little bit too blue-green, so I added some cobalt violet light to warm the gray up slightly. Then I'm going to use this to paint a line to represent a table, and I'm going to darken the wall slightly using a light wash and some dry brush textures. Once the vase is dry, I feel like I can add to the intensity, so I used the same dark green mix from before and I went over certain parts, especially around the outline, to darken the tone slightly. Then using a light wash of the same color, I painted the reflection of the vase on the table, but I realized here I forgot to paint the stems as a reflection too, so if you're going to paint along to this, don't forget to do that part to make it look more convincing. Then here I'm using the gray to also add texture and a bit of shadows under the flowers as well, since it's not clear and reflecting light like the vase. And for a bit of added detail, I also added a touch of burnt sienna on some of the bottom stems, and also a darker green to give it a little bit of gradient so the color doesn't look too flat. I always like to create a little bit of dynamic movement for these types of paintings, so I added some splatters and painted some smudge dots using the color of the flowers. Then as the final step, I'm going to use some white gouache to paint the 4-petaled flower shape I showed at the beginning, and I'm going to place this on top of the flowers that we've painted, but I'm only doing this sparingly as you only need a few shapes per flower to convince your eyes to recognize the shape of the petals. So I'm just going to apply this to all of the flowers, including the one at the bottom. And that's basically the final step, so I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I know someone actually suggested for me to paint hydrangeas, but I don't remember who specifically, so I'm sorry. But I've personally been wanting to paint this also, since I also like hydrangeas and I finally decided to make it, which is why this one took me so many tries to produce the tutorial. This is actually my 3rd time filming this since I was still trying to figure out the best understandable step, with also the most appealing as I can make it aesthetically. This is on top of the many tries that I painted beforehand, but after all the time and effort, I'm quite happy with how this turned out, along with how I broke down the steps. So I really hope this video makes sense for you guys to follow along. So yeah, that's basically it. I hope you guys enjoyed this one and learned something new. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, even though this is quite a long one, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!